believe that this is the first generation that the family can speak with more of a neutral authority than would have been the case up as far as this.
Looking at it from their perspective, this was a man that was regarded as having single-handedly won the war, shot in his own county by his former friends.
Who shot Michael Collins? Pete Carney thought he did, Sean Galvin said that he did, Sidney Neal reported to said that he did, Mike Donovan said he saw the man who did, Jimmy Orman fired directly at him and said he saw the man fall, Bob Startley heard a fired shot and said he saw him fall, and Joe Murphy thought he might have.
George Bernard Shaw had given a press interview on the 19th of August. Ireland is obviously on the point of losing its temper savagely.
Everyone was affected by what happened in the Civil War. Every village, every town knew someone that died, or any of the atrocities and the killings and the shootings that take place in the Civil War. There's no town, I doubt, that wasn't affected by the events that happened in the Civil War. It's so personal.
I suppose the Republicans are squeezed out of the cities and into the countryside, where they hold quite strongly certain areas, and it's very dangerous for the National Army to try to link up their garrison towns, even on patrols or supplies, for quite a long period of time. And it's one of those that Collins runs into.
So very often conspiracy theories have a life of their own, and those who believe in them, there's nothing that can be said to dissuade them. All conspiracy theories, by definition, one cannot disprove them. If one could, there wouldn't be a theory.
One of the things as a documentary maker, and especially when you're doing history, is you want to tell facts as accurately as you can. One of the problems doing this is when something is completely overloaded with conspiracy. No matter how you make a film, you'll have detractors who will argue something else, will argue a different version of history. All we can do, unless we actually exhume the body, is throw out different versions of this history in terms of the evidence. We certainly hope not to discredit anybody by doing the film, but we do hope to shine a more accurate light on the surroundings of Béal na Bláth.
My name is Aine Broy, and my father is Ned Broy.
Okay. So could you just tell me what this is, just when I'm opening this up?
The death notice for Michael's death, the newspapers report. In those days they always did that. You see, the Irish Press Cuttings Agency, they would take all the reports, everything about him, and they even have the Spanish and German reports about them and the French.
As well as being very close to Michael Collins, your dad was Garda Commissioner in 1933 to 1938. Who did he think killed Michael Collins?
My father told me it was not Emmett. That's the only good thing that I know.
And there are many people who think that Emmett Dalton either intentionally or unintentionally actually shot Collins himself. No, I think that's not correct, because Emmett Dalton did not have the kind of weapon which actually killed Collins.
In my interview with Sean Lemass back in 1970, when I went around the country for a couple of days with a recorder, and I got hold of Lemass and said, what did, and I think it's the last interview Lemass ever gave before he died. He said that Ernie knew in August, they all knew in August that the game was up, and but he just went on fighting. And they all did, despite their despondency.
And people don't recognise this today, but Collins fully intended to have another go.
Yeah, he did.
Once he won the Civil War, he was going to try and destabilise the North too and get the 6. He hadn't fought for 26 counties, he'd fought for a 32-county Irish Republic.
Yeah.
These men who, even though the Republicans claimed that's what they were doing, the irony of the Irish situation was that in order to achieve a republic, including a Republic of Northern Ireland, Collins had to defeat the Republicans. History's full of those ironies.
The anti-treaty side didn't see this stepping stone argument.
Yeah.
They didn't see the stepping stone. They wanted it now. That's what I think Collins was trying to do. He was trying to get the guys to stop the fighting and let's get the stepping stone going.
Tom Barry's wedding photo of August 22nd, 1921 reveals the tragic irony of a split nation. Michael Collins can be seen in the back row. 1 year later, he will be ambushed by anti-treaty such as Liam Deasy sitting beside the bride and Jim Hurley, who is standing to Collins's right. De Valera was also in Béal na Blá the day of the ambush and can be seen sitting here between the bride and groom. Other victims of the split in the photo are Harry Boland, anti-treaty, Rory O'Connor, anti-treaty, and Sean Hales, pro-treaty. Exactly 1 year later, Michael Collins would be dead.
The summer of 1922, the Civil War was figured out. It was practically done.
And then down to Fenit in Kerry, 1st of August, they come in by boat into Fenit and then drive the Republicans out into the rural parts.
The Republicans failed, with the exception of a brief stand outside Kilmallock, to resist the advance of the Free State troops anywhere in the country. While some of this can be put down to the Free State advantages in arms and equipment, the Republican leadership under Liam Lynch also failed to devise any coherent military strategy, allowing their positions to be picked off one by one. On top of this, most of the Republican fighters showed little appetite for a civil war, generally retreating before National Army attacks rather than putting up with determined resistance.
Several reasons. Number one, he was trying to make a deal with the anti-treaty forces. But he went down there because he thought in his own county, as he said, they will talk to me, and he thought he could get a deal that nobody else could get.
Emmett Dalton's report. Dalton has said that Collins, the Commander-in-Chief, had two objects in visiting my command area. The first being to inspect the military organisation and to appreciate the difficulties of the military problem with a view to giving his advice, and in order that he might more easily render the necessary assistance from General Headquarters, having seen for himself the position.
He was the bondsman, he did it all alone, and he knew how important money was to financing a campaign.
His second object was of a civil nature. In his capacity as chairman of the Provisional Government and Minister of Finance, he was anxious to make every effort to recover some of the thousands of pounds that had been extorted from banks by the irregulars or anti-treaty prior to their retreat from the city.
He was tracing the funds to find out where the money was so he could bring the Civil War to a swift conclusion as soon as possible.
During July, the IRA collected $120,000 in customs revenue and had hidden this money in the accounts of sympathisers.
The stolen money was excise duties belonging to the Customs and Excise Department, and it amounted to £120,000. They obtained the money by capturing the official collector, retaining him, and under threat of force, making him sign the cheques that, of course, the bank honoured and paid.
Collins had the bank directors identify the suspicious accounts. Then he concluded that 3 first-class men will be necessary to conduct a forensic investigation of the banks and the customs and excise in Cork. He told Cosgrave to consider 3 people, but don't announce anything until he returned.
Upon his arrival in Cork City at 8:30 p.m. on Sunday the 20th of August, General Collins complimented my officers and I upon the success of our expedition.
Collins was not merely on a tour of duty, but was trying to conclude a peace and establish post-Civil War conditions of governance.
Collins was visiting down south. There was an element of he wanted to go home for a while as well, because when he was down there, he visited Mary twice and he visited Johnny once, right?
He then arranged a meal with his relatives, his sister Mary Collins Powell and her family, and other friends in the city.
On Sunday, 20th of August in the evening, Collins met his sister, Mary Collins Powell, and her son, Sean. My great-grandmother was Michael Collins's sister. Her son, Sean, was a quartermaster sergeant in the War of Independence.
Now, when they first met on the Sunday, yes, it was the Imperial Hotel, and she brought my granddad, Sean. Yeah, he was 17. Now, Sean he went on to become Chief of Staff of the Irish Army. He wanted to go with him, and he was told no. Now, Mary noticed how ill he was.
And described it as a heavy cold.
And she did put her hand on his forehead and said that if she felt he had a temperature, you know, and did ask him, did he actually have pleurisy and why was he sweating?
How physically ill he was. I mean, if you look at the Hanny Collins letters, she documents in his last few months he was deeply unhappy with the Civil War. Deeply.
The following morning, Collins and General Dalton went on to the Cork Examiner to discuss the general Free State position on publicity with the editor, Tom Crosby.
On the morning of the 21st, accompanied by me, he inspected various military posts in the city, after which he interviewed several prominent citizens, including the managers of the various banks, in connection with the stolen money. In the afternoon, we motored to Macroom, where he inspected the garrison and the military posts.
Dalton felt in his own words that normality and law and order would not be too far off. We were in possession of the principal towns in County Cork. Michael Collins and I discussed this on the journey through West Cork.
Michael Collins's convoy arrived at the Williams Hotel, now known as the Castle Hotel in Macroom. AGS Brady recalls, "The bar at the rear of the shop was packed with military men, standing at ease in groups. I see Collins as he was that afternoon, an impressive, stalwart figure, restless with dynamic energy. He had taken his military cap off. His expression in repose had a set look of determination and a shadow of underlying ruthlessness. Then, owing to the fact that the escort armoured car was not running satisfactorily, we found it necessary to return to Cork. He spent 2 hours in interviewing his friends in the city. Later on the same night, a member of the neutral IRA believed to be Sean Hegarty, arrived at the Imperial Hotel to speak with Collins. They had a long talk, after which Michael Collins promised news to him, and then started a wrestling match with him. Before retiring, he arranged to devote the entire following day to a tour of inspection of the command area as far as Bantry.
The unofficial version is that he was trying to reach a settlement with the other side. There were heavy anti-treaty activity in Cork, and there were a lot of neutral officers who were trying to bring the sides together.
Michael Collins was enmeshed in a complicated web of peace feelers before the events in Béal na Bláth.
Enemy of the treaty were a relatively small faction in the country. And once the treaty passed in the Parliament, it was de facto accepted, even though there was blood to be shed, and never made these the speeches about the necessity of wading through blood if it were accepted.
The public still voted for the treaty, though, anyway.
Well, the public voted the treaty in.
And the indications are that the peace talks and efforts that went on behind the scenes were not official, because Liam Lynch and Ernie O'Malley certainly don't, like the Chief of Staff and his Assistant Chief of Staff, certainly don't give any impression that they want any negotiations whatsoever.
Yeah. Liam Lynch's star was not a rising star at this point.
No.
He had surrendered in Limerick and had basically run.
Yeah.
Surrendered in Clonmel and run.
Yeah.
Surrendered in Fermoy and run. As a leader, he wasn't leading and had lost the civil war within 6 weeks. As a leader, he wasn't the populist guy as he was prior to his killing.
And there were people behind the scenes desperately trying to get a peace agreement, but they would have been targets because they're in a war zone, you know.
Dunbreen was in Clonmel, I believe. He contacted O'Duffy early in August to ask for a safe pass to meet Collins. O'Duffy said no, don't do that, but Collins apparently sent his right-hand man Frank Thornton to Clonmel.
And in his military service pension file, it specifically mentions that he was Michael Collins' special courier.
Yeah, there was a priest who was talking to them both, and they were both supposed to meet. And this comes across in Dan Breen's interview to the military archives. Yeah.
Father Dick McCarthy of Limerick was anxious to arrange a meeting between the two at Hickey's of Glenville. Dan Breen's witness statement has stated, on August 21st, 1922, information had been received through intelligence officers that a convoy was expected from Dublin and would arrive by the Killusty Road. The large party which was expected did not arrive, but one of the intelligence officers, Colonel Frank Thornton, did arrive, accompanied by a sergeant and 3 privates. It was decided to block the road by felling a tree. The tree had hardly been felled when a Ford motor car came along the road. Only a few of the column were in position when the car, containing 5 Free State soldiers, came along. The machine gun section was actually beside the tree when the car appeared. Both parties opened fire almost simultaneously. The whole affair was over in a minute. The driver and another soldier were mortally wounded, being literally riddled with bullets, and their legs were actually reduced to pulp, owing to the close range at which they were shot and the concentrated nature of the fire. Colonel Frank Thornton himself was desperately wounded in the stomach, right arm, leg and back. Interestingly, Dan Breen doesn't mention the attack on Collins at Béal na Bláth, which happened on the 22nd of August.
He was shot just out northeast of Clonmel town, just outside the town.
And
on his way back, I think. He was very badly wounded. I mean, he got 2 bullets in the pelvis, and he had other fragments in the leg and the arm.
What we know is that there was a general order to challenge every Free State convoy passing through anti-treaty areas.
Michael Collins was in no rush for peace talks, but was willing to keep his lines of communications open. Ernest Blythe has said the onus was on the anti-treatyites to stop.
Tom Ennis, who was Dublin Brigade, one of the Dublin Brigade OCs, and was stationed in Cork. He was carrying out peace manoeuvres and had made an attempt to try and not even broker a deal, but approach the other side with a view to getting some sort of truce or an agreement to end it, you know. A lot of them felt very uncomfortable about how it was developing.
On the morning of the 20th of August, as Michael Collins was about to leave, Joe Sweeney had advised, "I don't know what you're up to, but I would advise you not to go." "Ah, nobody will ship me in my own county," the big fellow replied.
Collins' first stop was at Marybury Jail, now Portlaoise Prison, where he met Tom Malone about ending the Civil War. He asked if Malone would attend a meeting to try and put an end to this damn thing.
He went into Portlaoise Prison, and after meeting Tom in Portlaoise Prison, he slapped the desk and says the 3 Toms are going to fix this.
You know the famous thing about Collins saying, you know, I'm going to try and sort this. I'm going to talk to the 3 Toms. He doesn't mention Lynch.
No, that's when he was talking to Tomás Ó Muilleán, and he was in prison, a bit like going to Pentonville to see Tom Hales when the treaty had been signed, and Tomás Ó Muilleán was anti-treaty, and he's there again explaining why, and he says to him, if I had the 3 Toms with me, they'd fix it. And the 3 Toms were Tomás Ó Muilleán, Tom Hales and Tom Barry, all proven men, you know, strong leaders, military men, like proper, you know, military men.
And you made actually a very good point in the talk last night, that when he was shot in August 22, if he wasn't shot, the Civil War probably would have ended in October. Yeah.
At Limerick's barracks, the officer commanding of the Southern Command, General Ona Duffy, met Collins and discussed its belief that the Civil War could soon be over, and understood that Collins wanted to avoid any rancour. Collins entered in correspondence with Liam Lynch. Collins would note that Lynch would not be in a position at this stage to enter talks.
The treaty side they viewed themselves as the army. The pro-treaty side viewed themselves as the legitimate, democratic mandated national government,
as it would be seen as a form of conditional surrender and could compromise or split his forces. In response to peace feelers, August 4th, Lynch wrote to Collins.
Lynch had written, "When the provisional government ceased their attack on us, defensive action on our part can cease."
Collins wrote back, replying, "The time for face-saving is past. The choice is between the return of the British and the irregulars."
Michael Collins replied on the 4th of August, "This government has made it fully clear that its desire is to secure obedience to proper authority. When an expression of such obedience comes from the irregular leader, I take it there will be no longer any necessity for arms conflict."
The anti-treaty members of the old IRA, called irregulars, was formed with Liam Lynch that poor sad man, as chief of staff. But kind of a Ulysses in ways, wasn't he, Liam Lynch? You know,
absolutely. In what sense do you mean, though? Like,
well, he was a kind of the old Celtic heroic. I think of him in the mountains, fighting for all he was worth and being abandoned by his own.
When Collins was shot in August 1922, the Civil War was practically over.
I honestly believe that a very simple decision was made. That the decision was made to reignite the Civil War by shooting Collins.
According to an army report on peace negotiations in the Sean O'Mahony papers, that on the 19th of August, in the early morning, Michael Collins replied to Emmett Dalton, requesting the names of the prominent citizens who had given him a set of terms for peace negotiations. The terms included 1. A week's truce to be immediately arranged on the basis of the existing military position. 2. During this interval, facilities are to be afforded to the Republican military and political leaders to hold a meeting to discuss the making of peace on the following lines. 1. Republican opposition to the government and Parliament to be on constitutional lines. 2. Members of the Republican forces who desire to return to civil life will be allowed return to their occupations without molestation or penalisation. 3. Members of the Republican forces who wish to join the National Army will be received therein with due recognition of rank and service. 4. Arms and munitions in possession of Republican forces will be handed over to a committee to be mutually agreed upon. 5. There will be a general amnesty for all political prisoners. Emmett Dalton had given the following names: M. Aylward, Frank Barrett, and Frank Aiken. Michael Collins agreed to a meeting. The anti-treaty members supplied Emmett Dalton with details of landmines, ruined bridges, etc., generally assuring a safe conduct for the Commander-in-Chief. An armoured car escort was to be included, serving as both deterrent to possible attack and an identification in case an outlying post had not been contacted in time. Michael Collins was sceptical of the overtures of these three Republicans. On the margin of the original document, he wrote quotations: Aylward, shoot them down. Frank Barrett, spare no free state. Aiken, something else. This army report is quite clear on why Michael Collins took the route he did. Collins went the only route to West Cork that the Republican details allowed him to. The Béal na Bláth route was known to be clear. Bill McKenna, a member of Collins's party on that evening, had said they had maps provided by the IRA to show the blocked and mined roads. On the 27th of August, a memorandum from Liam Lynch to Ernie O'Malley had said, there have been peace negotiations started again in Cork recently, I understand, and probably arose out of Collins's visit to Cork. However, there can be no negotiations except on the basis of the recognition of the Republic. Recent events may change the situation. On the evening of the 19th of August, Michael Collins told Patrick Moylett, I'm going to try and bring the boys around. If not, I shall have to get rough with them. In Michael Hopkinson's Green Against Green, the Civil War book, Michael Collins' personal diary outlines his proposals for peace. Republicans must accept the people's verdict on the treaty, but could then go home without their arms, We don't ask for any surrender of their principles. We want to avoid any possible unnecessary destruction and loss of life. But if Republicans did not accept Collins' terms, further blood is on their shoulders.
He was in the Imperial Hotel in Cork, that was the headquarters of mBlath, of the forces occupying Cork, the Free State Force. They left 6:15, if I'm not mistaken. He noted it in his notebook.
And Collins, that day, left the Imperial Hotel, went to Macroom first.
The townlands, and more importantly the countryside in Crookstown, Béal and Nuisancestown area, were key West Cork hiding injured and a route to Kerry during both wars, and was firmly anti-treaty territory. Collins would have known that this was the most dangerous spot for him to be in.
If this is where the headquarters really is, this is where the Republicans who really matter and can end this thing are, then Collins has to go to them.
At 7:30 a.m., the convoy of Collins had reached Macroom. Michael Collins had a meeting at closed doors with Florrie O'Donoghue.
Florrie O'Donoghue was head of the neutral IRA. Florrie O'Donoghue did his job in Cork. Florrie O'Donoghue was director of operations, so he was a significant figure.
They had already met the day before, when O'Donoghue, who was erroneously under arrest in the town, watched Collins arriving and asked his warder to warn the commander-in-chief. He was promptly released and had a talk with Collins.
They went first to Macroom. They had some equipment to bring there.
And when you say equipment, was it a machine gun or something?
It was a loose gun, if I'm not mistaken.
The first phase of the Civil War was ended. O'Donoghue later wrote, he and many others recognised at this point that the IRA Republicans could not win the war and that Collins came south searching for peace. Collins was desperately trying to bring the war to a close, as well as trying to give some face-saving agreement to the leaders on the other side. So, even though O'Donoghue was a willing, neutral party acting as an open envoy to both parties, for the ambush party not to know Collins was in the area, O'Donoghue must not have done his job. This is incredulous. Other evidence would have to be ignored to support this assumption. No communications came from Cork, from the banks, the hotels. Collins stayed in the Imperial, the Guard stayed in the Victoria, or from the anti-treaty intelligence still present in Cork. Nor the account holders who were holding the money on behalf of the Republicans, whose money had effectively been frozen. Florence O'Donoghue, who had been in contact with Hales on a plan to end the Civil War before this, must not have contacted, if this were to be true, divisional headquarters, where Dev was holding a meeting with anti-treaty, which is most unlikely.
It is believed that their conversation was related to peace talks. When saying goodbye, Florrie O'Donoghue warned Collins to be careful, but Collins dismissed the risk. Both Tim Pat Coogan and Garda Hickey's account have suggested that Collins was expected at the house of Canon Tracy of Crookstown during his last visit. The reason being for the visit was to make contact with some intermediaries. This stop at Crookstown would explain the seemingly inexplicably circuitous Béal na Blá route back to Cork.
Yeah. The enemy of the treaty were a relatively small faction in the country.
I suppose it's like having all the top people in one area and something goes off. They're there for a reason.
When the IRA there saw him go by in the morning, they were outside of Denny Long's pub, and they saw him go by in the morning. They had actually asked for directions there. They knew if he was coming back, he had to come back that way. That's when they decided to have the ambush. Okay, it was not set up beforehand, it was afterwards.
Then they went through Crookstown trying to reach Bandon. And they got lost. There are several by roads and they got lost. And the Crossley tender and the motorcyclists went apart. They took a route. They didn't know where they were going, so the car stopped at the pub to ask directions. And that's when Collins was recognized. That was the touring car and the armored car.
By chance, the place had been chosen for a meeting of officers from the 3rd West Cork Brigade, due to take place later that day, ironically to discuss whether the brigade would remain in the war or withdraw from it.
And throughout West Cork, there were anti-treaty scouts.
The man outside the pub, Dennis Long, known as the Dane, was a lookout. He informed the Free State convoy of the direction to Bandon and proceeded to tell the anti-treaty men that he had recognised Collins. Liam Deasy was in the area for the staff meeting at Long's pub.
And Tom Hales, Jim Hurley, Tom Kelleher were officers of the 3rd Cork Brigade.
Okay.
And there were some officers of the 1st Cork Brigade because Béal na Blá is actually in the 1st Cork Brigade area. Saw Tom Hales, the commandant of the 3rd Cork Brigade, he saw that the war was dragging. They had no chance to win. They had made their point in arms, and it was time to pull off the war. So they were there, ironically, to discuss this. So it justified the presence of members of the division staff. The 3rd Corps belonged to the 1st Southern Division.
The meeting was scheduled for a date rather than a precise hour, as many of these officers were on the run.
This was their first staff meeting after the fall of Cork from Free State forces. He had been warned by Liam Lynch that De Valera wanted to make peace moves,
and not to give him any encouragement.
De Valera's aide-de-camp, Jimmy Flynn, was interviewed. In the O'Mahony papers, he states, De Valera joined the irregular officers, who were having a conference. It was there and then that De Valera heard that they planned to ambush Collins' party when that convoy must return to Cork City using the same route. When De Valera heard this, he addressed those present and asked them not to ambush Collins, as he himself was in the area with the express purpose of meeting Collins. De Valera was told that, while he was in the area, his status was that of a staff officer under the area commander, Liam Lynch. They were the active service under command of the same Liam Lynch, and they would carry through his wishes to plan the ambush. On hearing this, De Valera stormed out from the meeting in a rage, collected his belongings, and accompanied by his aide-de-camp Flynn, left the area, apparently having abandoned any hope of meeting Collins in Cork.
The order, I'd imagine it was Lynch, because, and again, like he was the man that was the overall, leader of the anti-treaty IRA. And you're right there in saying about De Valera wanting to, pursue the possibility of ending this in some way. I don't think De Valera really believed that this could happen, even though he made this speech, you know, wade through Irish blood. It's a very, very stupid, a very stupid speech to make. Barter Griffith had been doing the same in March, you know.
On the 22nd of August, De Valera was leaving for Dublin. Liam Deasy accompanied him to the crossroads of the ambush site at Béal na Blá. De Valera had expressed to Deasy that he would be uneasy that an ambush might be laid for Collins because if he was killed, his successor may be a weaker man. Michael Collins had known the majority of anti-treaty Republicans personally. His replacement may not.
According to Deasy's book, Brother Against Brother, De Valera had asked Deasy what was likely to happen now. Deasy replied that the men billeted in this area included many of those who had been forced to retreat from Limerick, Kilmallock and Buttevant, and in their present frame of mind would consider this incursion into the area which was so predominantly Republican as a challenge which they could not refuse to meet. I felt that an ambush would be prepared in case the convoy returned.
Long after De Valera had left, Collins was ambushed.
Professor T. Desmond Williams concluded both De Valera and Michael Collins were partly to blame for the Civil War. Michael Collins tried to do too much. De Valera too little.
Owen O'Duffy had mistakenly seen Liam Lynch as a tool of De Valera, when in fact it was the opposite that rang true. De Valera was a tool of Liam Lynch.
The anti-treaty divisional meeting headquarters was in Gurnlee, near Béal na Blá, and De Valera stayed there the night before and up to before noon on the day Collins was shot. And you have only one at that meeting that was anti-peace. So Liam Lynch's voice was the minority.
Yeah.
It was very much the minority voice. So how strong did De Valera speak?
Yeah.
It wouldn't have taken a whole pile for De Valera to unite weaker voices.
Lynch was getting increasingly annoyed that De Valera wished for the fighting to be stopped. Lynch had written to Ernie O'Malley 2 weeks after Collins' death on 5th of September that De Valera was the most pessimistic and regarded our position as hopeless. He even at the time contemplated public action which could ruin us.
Here, Eamon De Valera plays very little role. He's the politician as opposed to these younger people who go off and create a military coup, a junta that they wanted to have in their own. This would be the way that they would fight the treaty. The Republicans, the anti-treaty position was a true minority, and they had to develop the tactic which they had in the guerrilla war, the first war, which was let's go out and live with the people and see what we can do and fight again. And, you know, they found out later on that there was not great support. But that didn't stop the leaders going ahead with their position.
Once that first shell went into the forecourts, that's the sense that I think in Lynch's mind.
Flora Begley, the famous piper from Crossbarry, had said to Florence O'Donoghue in his papers that it leaked out that Michael Collins was coming south and that some members of the Dublin Brigade were coming to protect him, and that they didn't give a damn about the 3rd West Cork Brigade fellows. This got their goat, inferring Tom Kelleher, Jim Hurley, Liam Deasy. And they decided to have a go at the Dublin crowd.
On 21st of August, when De Valera had met Liam Deasy, De Valera had appealed to Deasy, who was in charge of the 1st Southern Division, that the anti-treaty had made their protest by fighting. But they couldn't hope of a military victory, and that it would be more honourable to withdraw. Deasy had disagreed with a lot of what De Valera had said, although he argued that there were 1,000 men under arms in the 1st Southern Division, and there was no way they would agree to an unconditional surrender, according to his book, Brother Against Brother.
The meeting was held the night before, was left unresolved. It continued in Murray's house the following morning.
Okay.
And Lynch outlined his position that an attack on Collins would generate a resparking of intent by anti-treaty forces and reignite, remembering that an awful lot of the anti-treaty forces were back home. That reignition would meant a dramatic event.
Yeah.
And the dramatic event would be the assassination of Collins. Following that meeting, he left, De Valera left, and Liam Deasy retired with Crofts to Granarray, to divisional headquarters.
De Valera was very conscious of the fact that the IRA were beginning to be seen as bandits. When he visited MP William O'Brien on the 12th of August, O'Brien had raised the question of the destruction by the Republicans of the railway viaduct over the Blackwater at Mallow. He had said a few people in the area were against the anti-treatyites until it was blown up.
You know, the people thinking, why are they doing that to us? It's our own that's doing that to us. Our livelihoods are being so affected by it. So really, crucially, you need to win the hearts and minds of the people in the Civil War, and the way to do that is to not blow up the means to their livelihood. So if you look at it from Lynch's point of view, an enemy commander, like, you know, Lynch is the commandant of the anti-treaty IRA, and coming into his territory is the leader of the pro-treaty, you know, the National Army. So it's like two giants in one place. And the way Lynch probably saw it was, one of us is going to leave here, and our own is going to be alive. It's going to be me. And Tom Hales actually didn't want to ambush the convoy. He really didn't want to do it. But after discussing it and so on, it was decided, look, they are the enemy. They're coming into our territory. We can't let it happen. Can't go, you know, unmolested. There's going to be an ambush, and Tom was put in charge of planning it. Didn't want to do it at all, because if you'd imagine, you know, this was a man who was his friend. You know, he was on opposite sides in the Civil War to his brother, and despite that fact, there was never any animosity between Tom and Sean. I understand why he'd be reluctant, because this is a man who, you know, was very close to his family, had, you know, promoted him through the ranks, was a very dear friend. So, you know, why would he want to be the man that was in charge of a party that was going to kill him? But he was a commanding officer, he was a leader. You follow orders. If you're the man that's chosen to do it, what is the other option? You do it or you don't, and then what's the outcome if you don't? And he was then the one that was delegating the positions of where, you know, the immediate group should be. It was decided that they would pull the horse cart.
And they lined up the ambush and took a cart full of empty bottles, beer bottles, and lined it across the road and had a mine under it.
So the plan was that's there, it slows the convoy down, there's a mine that will go off. And tactics that were used, very well by Tom Barry and so on, in the War of Independence. And that was the plan. Then he'd open up.
An 84-year-old Tom Foley told Father Patrick Toohig in the dark secret of Béal na Bláth that he saw Liam Deasy drawing the battle lines and establishing the field of fire. Foley also had helped Deasy set up a Lewis machine gun on a rock overlooking the road. Toohig has noted that Liam Deasy astutely omitted details of the arrangement in his book Brother Against Brother.
He passed through Bandon. Sean Hayes was the officer in charge, he wasn't there. So he went to Clonakilty, his native town. The road was blocked with trees. He took an axe and helped to take the tree off the roads.
Collins had a meeting with local officers and headed to Clonakilty, where they had lunch.
And then they went to Rosscarbery, Skibbereen, and they were expecting to go to Bantry and return to the Kilmichael Road to Macroom. But the Bantry officers were in Skibbereen, so he met them in Skibbereen, and they have a talk. And then he decided to return to Bandon to meet Hales, General Hales.
While Michael Collins was meeting Free State troops, the ambushers on the anti-treaty side were busy finalising their plans to attack Collins's convoy. They decided, according to Hales, on a divisional order, according to Deasy, due to a general order to engage any Free State forces to prepare an ambush in the case that Collins would return for the same route. Another person who arrived later during the day after the decision was Taigo Sullivan, who was quartermaster of the 3rd Cork Brigade. He was a brother of the Free State Adjutant General Taigo Sullivan and a second cousin of Michael Collins. Now he was on the other side. The ambush was set about noon, a mile from the Béal na Bláth cross, on the road to Bandon, where a small road, a boreen, parts from the road on the west over a small bridge, Carroll's Bridge, and runs parallel to it for some 750 metres, up to another road heading west, a Halarick Bridge. Later in the afternoon, Collins's convoy travelled from Clonakilty to Rosscarbery and reached Skibbereen around 4 p.m, where he had a meeting with officers from there and from Bantry. Since he had already met the officers from Bantry, they had decided to go back to Bandon instead of taking the Kilmichael Road to Macroom. He visited the home he had grown up in as a boy.
There, he said to Dalton, "There is where I was born. That was my home."
He doesn't go to Woodfield, which is 200 yards behind the pub, but it's another narrow road that the convoy couldn't get into. So he pulls up at the Four Alls pub, pretty well the way it was then, the road, and he goes in. One of the O'Brien's relation living in the house just beside the granite medallion monument is asked to go down for Johnny. He's still down in the farm living with Mickey Collins next door.
In the afternoon, the convoy went to Rosscarbery, and Collins had a drink at the Four Alls pub owned by his cousin Jeremiah. So in essence, this was family reunion. Four Alls pub is within a field of the Collins home farm.
At the Four Alls pub, Johnny comes up to talk to him. They have a pint of Rassler together, or maybe two, who knows. It could have affected his his actions at Béal na Bláth, he 2 or 3, because he jumped up while still under fire, maybe he shouldn't have, and he chats to Johnny and the other relatives, who the O'Briens, around the place.
Collins declared, "I'm going to settle this thing. I'm going to put an end to this bloody war." There was no sign that he was open to compromise. Clearly, any hope he had of settling the civil war would not be done at the expense of the treaty. He was talking at this point to his brother Johnny. Collins told his brother Johnny that he would go further with the British government once there would be peace here. His principal aim was to end the civil war, he said. "The British have given up their claim on us. When we begin to work together, we can help those in the northeast."
Chats to Johnny and the other relatives, who the O'Briens, around the place, and any of the other neighbours, with this big convoy and armoured car and so on, and then takes off up the road. He jumps out in the middle of Pearse Street, jumps into John O'Crowley, who's a friend and a distant relative, and my mother and Mary are in there, and he sweeps my mother up and says, "Kitty," and she says, "I'm too old to be kissed." And he's struggling, "Oh, you're not. Puts her down, does the same with Mary, who's a year older, Mary Collins. And that was my mother. She never spoke about that until she was out in Our Lady's Manor out in Dalkey. In a sort of a guilty way, I shouldn't have said that to Uncle Michael, but she was 10. Then hops into the back out, talks to John O'Crowley for a few minutes, back out, Clonakilty to Bandon.
While Tom was reluctantly overseeing the planning of the ambush, Sean Hales, because he was a Brigadier General in the National Army, he was stationed in Bandon.
Stops at the Munster Arms Hotel, talks to Sean Hales.
And he was actually stationed in the Devonshire Arms Hotel, but then it moved down to the Munster Arms.
Around 7 p.m. Okay. I believe. And they talk again, closed doors, for about half an hour.
It's thought that Hales was informed of a meeting Collins had attended with Civil War neutrals in Cork that evening, and he had met already with Florence O'Donoghue and others the day before and discussed how to end the war and how this end could be achieved.
And he had told them, "Don't go down that road. It's too dangerous. It's too dangerous. You cannot go down. They're out to get you." Because Sean Hales, from personal experience, knew they were in hostile territory, even though it was their own area, and it was a war.
Collins was delayed. He had just left Bandon, where the head of the army down in Bandon was Sean Hales, a brother of Tom Hales, who was on the other side and in the ambush lined up to shoot Collins. I mean, that's sort of the characterization, if you like, in a broad way, of the wind that shakes the barley. It was the most significant brother against brother image of the Hales brothers.
On the road out of Bandon, Collins said to Dalton, "If we run into an ambush along the way, we'll stand and fight them." Collins was aware that this was the danger area. He was also in no doubt that the anti-treaty Republicans knew exactly where he was at any given time.
Meanwhile, 10 kilometres further north, Sean's brother, Tom Hales, in Béal na Bláth, had just managed to convince the other officers that Collins likely had gone through another road, and they should better dismount the ambush. They proceeded to disconnect the mine, while the men started to go away to neighbours' houses to take a rest and a meal. and left a number of men behind to finish removing the scene.
Tom Barry in his final years of his life made a claim to the Collins family that the roads had been mined, save one. Anti-treaty forces knew of the presence of Collins and had arranged a pathway through. The way back was not guaranteed to be safe, as it depended on the result of meeting in Béal na Bláth.